Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz singer, artist, and educator Sandra Marlowe. We caught up with her in early August 2020 to talk about her new CD coming out in September 2020, The Heart Always Remembers. We also touched on this new world of COVID-19. She was born into a family of singers, musicians, and poets on the rural plains of North Dakota, and her solo career began at 6 with the shy but righteous rendition of Do Lord before an old-time revival meeting congregation. She has great stories. Get to know her.
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Good. Thanks for taking a minute out today. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm very curious to see what you want to know more about.
Well, I'm just going to kind of probe a little bit probably into what's on everybody's mind, which is COVID-19 and, kind of your history with music and, maybe kind of the future. So, to begin, and then obviously your new album, The Heart Always Remembers, that's due out in September. Talk to me a little bit about first, COVID-19 has shut down live jazz. Everything kind of, it's kind of our 9/11 moment, so to speak, in this part of the century.
Yeah.
When in early to mid-March did you realize dominoes were falling and things were coming to a halt?
Well, the funny thing, it's a very good question. I recently moved out of the Bay Area, California. I moved up into northern Idaho, and I have been sort of finding my jazz peeps up here in Idaho and checking out a small scene that there is. And I had just completed my first full-on show in northern Idaho here at a place called the Jacqueline Arts and Cultural Center, like about 4 days before all of this COVID thing hit. And it was like boom. I was glad that I got my first show in. The unfortunate thing was I was sort of really connecting with musicians and getting my inroads and getting my feet wet in the new area. So within, I think it was like March 6th, I had my show. Had a great turnout, a nice response, wonderful musicians. And so it was like about 3 days later, the whole thing started to unfold. And the biggest thing for me, well, because I was trying to get bookings, obviously, to do with the upcoming release and the of my new album. And you realized it was going to be a whole other ballgame because venues were like just suddenly shut. There was nobody home. And the big thing I think that for me was also an indicator was I teach. I'm an educator, and I have students, and suddenly I was not able to see students live at all. I mean, and I have a home studio that I teach from, and it's like suddenly my income went to zero. I mean, like immediately. It was unbelievable. It was like, oh, so that was, I think, for me. But I was really glad I had just done this show, and I was thinking, oh, this is great. I'm kind of out there. I met some people. I'm going to get some more bookings, da-da-da-da-da. And it was like, boom. Suddenly, it was like everything shut down. Yeah, it was very shocking as a musician and performer. Yeah.
Without a doubt. Well, and you're releasing an album during a pandemic where you can't back it up live, but, maybe people have more time to listen. What are your thoughts on releasing an album during this time period?
Well, it's kind of interesting to me. I was thinking about that because obviously, as most musicians know, an album, you're usually a couple years, at least I am, in the planning stages. So it was interesting that the title, The Heart Always Remembers, seemed to be kind of foreshadowing, which I didn't know at the time, because it had more of a personal take for me, looking back and choosing music for the album that reminded me of why I became a singer and looking back sort of in the past and recapturing that. So it was interesting that when the COVID thing happened and you realize, oh, wow, I'm going to be releasing an album during a time where you're right, there isn't a lot of opportunity for backup performance and touring and all those things. I thought, wow, well, this was kind of telling. The title meaning, I think we're all trying to kind of keep the heart alive of why we do what we do. And for most performers, of course, it's having an audience. But what is really interesting to me is how much the creative arts and that whole scene has come forward to adapt to the new sort of parameters under which at least we're currently living. I sort of refrain from calling it the new norm because it's trendy, but I keep hoping we're going to have a return to some normalcy. So with a lot of venues trying to stay afloat, offering live stream, having artists share their material, in that way, I think we're rising to the occasion, which I think is often what artists do. We find the pockets where we keep going. And I think it's vital during this time to do that because it's such a time of sort of cultural, isolation in terms of, or, art isolation, social isolation, that, we're kind of lucky that technology now offers us the opportunity to still connect. And I'm finding a lot of artists doing that. And actually looking forward, I'm thinking that probably any release shows that I will do, at least in the foreseeable future, would be finding live stream venues or offering it through that platform.
The thing that I've realized during this process is that jazz is definitely one of those things where musicians are thrown into the unknown and they make something once. I mean, there's no duplication of any night that you're on stage. It almost seems like what we're living through is kind of the ultimate version of improv.
You know what? It absolutely is. That's a really good reflection. And in more ways than one, we're just, even the experts and all the people who you expect to have answers don't really have the full answer on this. So we're kind of co-creators. We're creating this new world as we go forward, but and musically as well. So that's a very good thought. Yeah.
Interesting. So talk to me a little bit about your beginnings. Have you always been in the Bay Area? Kind of how did life become music for you?
That's a good one. No, I was not always in the Bay Area, although I spent many, many years in California. I was a young transplant. I was about 18 when I moved out of a state you don't always hear so much about, North Dakota. And I grew up there literally out in a very rural community. My father was a railroad agent, and there was maybe, at the height of our population was maybe 300 people, I think, in its heyday. So coming to California in the Bay Area was a huge leap for me in just spectrum of life experiences. So, and actually most of my early music, I come from a family of musicians and singers and generally creative, cultural, crazy people. And so most of my background was classical piano at the time and classical singing. I took a lot of that type of training. And then moved more into probably pop. I was in my 20s, 30s doing a little bit of musical theater. But I always had a flair for jazz, and that's where I always wanted to go. But I didn't have a lot of early exposure to it. So it wasn't until I got into California and was kind of honing my craft and sitting in and, piano bars, jam sessions, open mics, that kind of thing, that I became much more exposed and definitely ended up with so many musician friends who were jazz people, and that's kind of how it's kind of like I graduated to jazz, I in some ways say, because I didn't have a lot of early exposure to it, and yet I think it's where my soul always was, or my heart. So what do you like the best about being a performer? Well, that has changed over the years. I think as a young performer, a lot of what I was looking for was validation, acknowledgement. For me, the journey with performing music and who I am as a person has been very entwined. I think that's just goes with the territory, at least for me. So as a young person, I think it was a lot about needing to prove myself in some way, needing to say, okay, good, people recognize I'm a singer and I'm fairly good and I kind of know what I'm doing. And that's changed. It's changed as I've gotten older. I think more that you want to serve in some way, obviously your audience. And most of the coaching I had, and I've had some really, really good people I've worked with, the focus was, that communication with the audience. You're there to give them something. Through your words, through your songs, through who you are on stage, there's something you're going to give out to them. And it became more about, pleasing an audience in a way. Now it's probably, I would say I am there to serve in the moment. And that's really kind of the heart of jazz anyway, is what wants to come through. You are aware of your audience and you're giving them, there's such a communication there for me. That's what I do on stage. But it's also about serving something greater, in a sense. And maybe that has just come with some years, that there's this creative realm that you access, and it's amazing. Really, what you had said earlier, that nothing will ever be the same every night in a row, or whatever your show is. There are these moments that are just magic, and they're there and they're gone, and it's wonderful, just wonderful. So that's probably the biggest thing now, is to serve something greater.
What was the first live jazz show you saw that really made you think, man, that's something I want to do?
Oh my gosh. I'd have to really think on that. You're throwing me a curve. And this is funny, but it may not even be someone who was well known or famous. I'm thinking it was more probably some of the little hangouts that I used to go to, and hear somebody who really was kind of a master, that I would consider a jazz master, and see them. And I think in the early years, before I had much exposure, I was like, what are they doing? What is that? What, wow. And so it probably wasn't necessarily a particular artist, although certainly we're all influenced, and we appreciate, we have our list of people that we think are the best. But I think it was probably just being exposed in general to the improvisational nature of jazz, and then vocal jazz, whether they were scatting or doing melodic, rephrasing, or harmonics that you didn't expect. I think I was just intrigued in general by that, and then I thought, you know what, this is where I want to go, and I continue to grow, and that's the exciting thing, is I don't think you ever really have it. Whatever that journey is going to be for you creatively is your path. And for me, I still take workshops. I also do workshops, but I love hearing other artists and what they're doing. And so I think it's always a learning. So I hope that answers the question. I don't know that it's a specific artist or show that did it for me, but just in general.
So when COVID's over and we return to the stage, both musician and audience, what do you hope we realize from this time away from live music?
Well, God, I hope people appreciate it.
Yeah.
I hope they are willing to pay a few bucks to come out to shows and support artists. I mean, but long before COVID, this has been an ongoing saga of how to continue to get people to support live performances, and jazz is kind of its own beast, and it either has usually really rabid fans that are like diehard fans, or people who are like, ew, it's like black licorice, and that's the interesting thing. I think part of it is educating people what it is, but I would hope that people will just want to feel the joy and the spirit of live performance again. I'm hoping there is this resurgence. One of the things that I think is interesting is I try to cross kind of over genres. Like I said, I have some classical background. I'm also a pianist. So I recently did a show with a symphony, which doesn't normally necessarily maybe offer in the area I was doing it jazz. So we did a combination of some big band swing and added a couple jazz tunes with the symphony. We wrote in some string parts and some horn things, and it was just really cool. So I think that if everybody's opening their mind a little bit more, we can build maybe a stronger market for jazz And hopefully doing those kinds of crossover things also builds audience, because there may be classical people who would never go to a jazz thing, and yet if you pose it to them a little bit in their seasonal subscription, they're like, oh, we kind of like that. That was interesting. Or vice versa. You sort of, so I think I'm hoping, the world's going to come back with some kind of a new perspective on a lot of things about bridging cultures, bridging with people that we may not have a lot in common with, bridging, just being good human beings. So I'm hoping there's a resurgence. Yeah.
So everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, your fans, but you're living your life. Who do you think you are?
That's such a fun question.
Yeah.
Probably the first thing that comes to me is I'm a hard worker. And I'm kind of a long-distance runner. It's interesting because I reflected on this, too, in putting this project together, The Heart Always Remembers. Who am I? Where have I been? Because I have a few years on the planet now. And I've certainly stopped at a lot of things. My career has not been this trajectory straight up. It's been more one of working on this and then stopping over here to work on maybe this personal thing, and then, music is intrinsic. It's been a huge part of my life, but I would say I'm a hard worker. I keep at things. I'm usually long suffering, and I really am a long distance runner. And actually, I used to be, which is funny. I don't so much anymore. But I stick with things, and that's true of not just the music, but probably relationships and goals. I have a lot of faith, I guess. And it's the journey. It is the journey. I wish it were just the goal sometimes and I had a pot of money. But it's more about, learning along the way and who I run into along the way and where I grow and where I stick to it. That's probably true.
That was a great answer. Great way to wrap everything up. Thanks for taking a minute out today. I think the audience of Neon Jazz is going to get to know you pretty well. So good luck with the album. Stay safe out there. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate your time today, too. You take care.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest singers in Idaho, the Bay Area, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Sandra for her time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.